Welcome back. Margaret is here to discuss special education with a Catholic perspective. Margaret Walsh is a graduate of Thomas Aquinas College and received certification as an instructor with the Equipping Minds Therapy Program. Continuing her education, she went on to earn an MS in special education. She tutors students in person and also online, bringing her love of the Catholic faith and desire to share it with her students. Today, she will enlighten us with how learning takes place in body and soul and how to approach special education at home. Again, I invite you to type in your questions for Margaret in the Q&A box, which you will find at the bottom of your screen. Welcome, Margaret.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. This is an amazing opportunity for all of us to be here together. And thank you, Teresa, for the introduction. So I am very excited to be here and to be explaining what the process of learning is and how we use that in our everyday lives. Also, how students with special education learning needs also have that same process, but certain parts of it might need to be built up. And then in looking at the process, we're also going to be exploring this in the context of being Catholic. So having our Catholic faith is a huge gift that not many other people have and not many other people recognize because they don't have it. So hopefully this will bring a lot of hope to all of you guys. For any families who do have a student with special education learning needs, or if you know a family member or friend, just keep this in mind for them as well, so that you know, more families can find that little bit of extra that they're looking for, that pathway forward to true efficiency, I guess I would say. Anyway, so what I'm going to start off with today is looking at the thought process, and then we're going to see how that aligns with Catholic teaching and what that means for us kind of spiritually, which I think is really important for us to look at. And then what that means with regards to homeschooling with someone who has special education learning needs. So I'm going to share my screen first off. And I like visuals. They help me learn, and hopefully this can help you learn. If you look at any of the other videos that I've made before, you'll probably see this image pop up many times, but I think it's really helpful for us to use this and see it. So I'm going to create a couple different divisions here. So there are 3 different parts to the learning process. What happens is you get a sensory stimulus, so you read something, you hear something, and the first thing that needs to happen is that needs to get sent to your imagination. And then you conceptualize the information to a certain extent so that your mind can grasp it and retain it. And then what you do is you compare this image of the information to past experiences, a past knowledge, and the cogitative power takes that, compares it, figures out which box the information fits in, figures out what's most important about it, what's least important about it. And then when you've done all this comparison, it gets sent up to the intellect. And this is where the active understanding takes place, is in the intellect. It's where you get that moment where it clicks, or you get that aha moment, is what another term that people use. And then based on your understanding, it's knowledge that you possess now. Based on the understanding, you can make a choice about it. And then again, all of this kind of comes down through the same pathway back to us. So it's this big loop that goes kind of like this and back down. That looks kind of messy, so I'm going to undo some of that. But that's the basic gist of how someone goes through the thought process. And there are 3 different components that are being used in all of this. So the first component is the body. The second is the brain. And the third is the soul. So God made us body and soul And it's a unique combination where our body interacts with our soul. There's an integration there that can't really be broken. So we have the five senses that bring us the information. We also have the appetites, but that has to do with more social, emotional, and what I'm going to be addressing here is more academic. But we have the five senses that bring us the information. And then we have the brain. That's literally what's inside our heads. And that's what does a lot of the sorting, figuring out where the information goes, the processing of that information, the interpretation of the information. And then the last part that happens is the active understanding, which takes place in the soul. And that means that, and this last jump, I want to say this last jump, as far as I can tell, and I've talked to several other professionals, it doesn't seem like the last jump between the brain and the soul ever gets disconnected or ever has a difficulty when you're going through the learning process. So for students who have special education learning needs, any of the difficulties they're encountering are going to be in the body or in the brain, not in the soul. The soul is something beautiful that God has given us that can't really be corrupted physically. So I think this is really important to look at this and notice this, because when you're trying to figure out, okay, well, what steps is my student not able to complete? What steps are kind of holding my student back? You could see that any of those weaknesses are going to be in the body, so to speak. And God has created us with a body that can improve on itself and can change. If you think about like a marathon, I wouldn't be able to go out and run a marathon tomorrow because I haven't prepared my body for it. I haven't exercised and stretched and all that stuff. But if I exercised and stretched and worked myself up to that level, I would be able to go out and run a marathon. It's very similar with students who have special education learning needs. Their certain processes are not working very well, or they're not very strong, but God has given us the ability to improve on that and perfect it to the extent that we can. So for some students, this means, you know, they do 180 and they're able to function very, very well after working on the particular areas of weakness. Other students, it means they improve some. They might not improve as much as you would hope, but there is room for improvement. And even within the special education world, there's the term neuroplasticity, which means that the brain has the ability to change. And so for example, with patients who've had a traumatic brain injury and they need to go back for occupational therapy or cognitive therapy, just within that realm, not speaking about special education, but within the realm of like injury that someone undergoes, the doctors and the specialists try to get them back to the function that they had before. And it's a very similar process to students with special education learning difficulties, that they as well have some sort of weakness they're dealing with. And if you work on the right processing areas, you can help them get to a better place than where they were before. So you can help them improve and grow their abilities so that they can accomplish more and do it with greater ease, start enjoying learning and things like that. But I think this is also really beautiful because you can see that any of the difficulties occur in the body, but the soul is something that, as Catholics, we believe that we're created to know, love, and serve God in this world and to be happy with Him in the next. But knowing Him, certain people can do that to certain degrees, especially if they have special education learning needs. But God, because He created a soul in us, there is a unique pathway just between God and our soul that can't really be changed as long as we're in the state of grace. So we have the ability to live a Catholic life in the state of sanctifying grace, where we can grow and become holy and become saints, regardless of whatever physical or mental differences we might have. But at the same time, God has given us an ability to improve ourselves so that we can at least strive to know him better in this life and try to perfect ourselves so that we can know him better, just humanly speaking. So I think that's really hopeful, because a lot of students have special education learning needs. I've heard parents talk about this at different times. You know, I don't know if so-and-so is going to be able to receive communion, or I don't know if they're going to be able to know God very well. But the answer for that is we don't know how much God just reaches down directly and touches those individuals if that individual has a more significant learning difference. And that's a really beautiful thing, because there's like I said before, a direct line to God. So I think that's an important piece that not a lot of people see. And it brings us, again, more hope. And it gives us a straight pathway forward, knowing, okay, I need to look at the 5 senses to figure out how to help my student, or I need to look at the brain to see if there's something there where I can help support my student better, so that they can, just in general, do better with their academics, and also, again, with knowing God, which many of you know that that's the most important thing, the most important information that you could ever teach your student. So I hope that was helpful, looking at that diagram. Again, there are 3 sections. There's the body, then there's the brain, then there's the soul. And it's the body and the brain that have any of those weaknesses. So that's where you have to look. And again, our brain has the neuroplasticity. It has the ability to change, which is very important. Not all schools emphasize that portion of it, because a lot of schools, even homeschools, will say, okay, the only thing you guys have to do is accommodate your student. You know, if Johnny can't do 20 math problems, he can do 5, just to kind of get him through the day, get him through the week, get him through the year. But if you support your student with those modifications, which are important, it's important to get your student through the material and let them know that they can do some of it, and that they're encouraged to do some of it. And then also supporting them, trying to figure out what areas they're weak in, and helping support them in those areas so they can actually improve on that. That's also important. It's not always something that's emphasized or talked about when looking at special education. And I think it's been amazing. It's been an amazing journey for me to see that ability to change with the students, because what I've done is I've worked in remediation for over 5 years now. And that's the side of things where you're trying to help the student improve their abilities and move beyond their current difficulties. It's a growth mindset where you're looking at the student, you're trying to figure out, okay, which pathways are weak? Why are they weak? How can I improve these? It's also a growth mindset saying, you know, encouraging the student to challenge themselves and try to rise above their current difficulties, achieve greater things. Which is very important for those students. So because any of the difficulties are occurring in the body or in the brain, the first thing you need to check, again, you have to go through this kind of logically, the first areas that you need to check are the senses, the 5 senses. Although taste and smell are not necessarily associated with learning. But the sense of hearing, the sense of sight, and the sense of touch are directly related to learning. It's how we interact with the world around us, how we learn more about the world around us, how we learn more, again, humanly speaking, about God. So it's important to look at those areas. So when you have a student who has special education learning needs, one of the first areas to look at is the hearing. Can your student hear things? Can they interpret the sounds well? Not necessarily just being able to hear volume and pitch and stuff like that, but being able to interpret the sounds well. And that's oftentimes where you'll see difficulties with speech, difficulties with auditory memory and processing, difficulties with following directions, difficulties even with reading, because the auditory system is connected with our speech and language system, which is connected with our reading system. So that's an area that I would recommend looking into. Sometimes having an auditory weakness means that you have anxiety, you have ADHD, you're overwhelmed by too many sounds at once. So that's the sense of hearing. The other sense to look at is the sense of sight. So if your student is struggling with reading, eye strain. They're also having, sometimes math problems, not able to stay in the lines. That's where you want to check and see if there are any muscular difficulties, over focus, under focus difficulties with the eyes, the sense of sight. You want to make sure that that's working well and efficiently. And then also the sense of touch, which is in my mind kind of associated with the movement of our body. So when babies are developing, they go through different developmental phases where their movements are building up certain brain pathways, certain reflexes, and it's really important for them to go through a lot of those. So the movement and the sense of touch is related more with like occupational therapy, especially if you have a student who's a little bit older. Fine and gross motor movements, looking into that side of things, because that will also affect the learning process. So looking at auditory, so that would be, you could go to an audiologist and have them evaluate your student to see if they're having auditory processing weakness. And make sure they test for, again, auditory processing weakness or disability, because that's going to be different than just a hearing test, which is not going to tell you much, because it's not just what they hear, it's how they interpret that information. And then if you're wondering if your student has difficulty with their vision, you wouldn't just go to an optometrist, you'd go to a behavior optometrist, because they would again look at more of the focus and tracking difficulties if your student is encountering any of those. And then occupational therapists would be great for any of those finer gross motor movements, helping you figure out what areas you need to look at with that. And then a speech therapist is also, or a speech pathologist is going to be helpful with speech articulation, things like that. But again, you want to look at the auditory tract to see if there's a connection there. So looking at things from a more therapy perspective, I think is important, or at least knowing where to start and where to look, because again, I've talked to many families where they don't even know where to start, where to begin looking. And if you kind of know the general area to look in, then there are more and more resources that you can find online, or more and more resources you can find with professionals, as long as you kind of know where to look. So hopefully this is bringing you some of those ideas and resources so that you can explore this yourself and figure out what the best supports are going to be for your family. So that takes care of the senses. So you want to check the senses first to see if the student's encountering any difficulties there. The second part is looking at the brain processing and seeing if the student needs any support with the mental processing. So once you see something, again, like that image showed, you need to process it in your mind and figure out, okay, what particular weaknesses is this student encountering? It could be working memory, it could be processing speed, it could be categorization, what box does this fit into? And once you look at those, you can, again, develop a sense of, most of you probably, if you have a student with learning difficulties, you probably already know generically kind of what areas your student struggles in. They struggle with memory, or they struggle with focus, or they can't follow through with multi-step directions, or they can't articulate their understanding of something. And that again relates to the internal mental processing that the student does in the brain. And a lot of times it's either a difficulty with the imagination and building that initial image that's used for the other processing. So if you have an incomplete or imperfect image there, it's going to kind of translate and spill over into all the other processes. And you're going to, when you get to that final act of understanding, it's only going to be incomplete. And that's what many of you are seeing with your students who have special education learning needs. Or it has to do with memory and recall, kind of pulling things out of the memory and so that you can associate things. Or it has to do with, again, the processing and the sorting itself once you have that image. So there are a lot of components within that. So once you've checked off the senses and the sensory boxes, then you also want to look at the mental boxes and see if there's anything there. And this is, again, the growth mindset. It's looking at what is actually going on and how can I support that learning, versus so-and-so can't learn very well in this area, so we're just going to modify the curriculum so that we can just move them forward. That's important, but again, you also want to get to the root of the problem, and that's, to a certain extent, what our Catholic faith asks of us, is to perfect ourselves as much as we can so that we can do greater good for God's glory. And this is a way in which you're helping your student do that. Another thing to look at is nutrition, and that's because any of the things that we do with our body are supported by nutrition, whether it's exercising, studying, sleeping, any of those bodily functions are supported by nutrition. So that's something that not everyone looks at is nutrition. But that's kind of looking at it from the more therapy perspective. As a Catholic homeschooler, what I wanted to tell you guys is that, one, you're already doing your student a great service. Even if even if the public school is saying, we have all the resources, they don't necessarily have all the resources. You're automatically giving your student one-on-one attention at home, which is something that not all students get, even if they have an IEP in the school system. Oftentimes they don't get one-on-one teaching. But you're already doing that at home. You're supporting your student by loving them and letting them know that they're valued and they're an integral part of the family. You believe in them, you're encouraging them. That's really important. They don't always get that from teachers in the school system either. Sure, there might be some teachers that are really, really good, but it's, again, kind of hit and miss. But you're already accommodating at home. You're already supporting them with one-on-one teaching and learning experience. As homeschoolers, there are a lot more resources and a lot more ways that you can kind of think outside the box and figure out, okay, well, if this isn't really working at home, maybe I can do this instead. Or maybe I can reach out to this resource or that resource. If you're working within the school system, you're not necessarily able to do that because they have a very set and rigid way in which they help students with learning difficulties. So you're already doing your students a great service at home, and it is okay to homeschool if your student has special education needs. What I would say is that homeschooling with a student who has special learning needs, it's important to look at the therapy side of things, but it's also important to find good resources. So figuring out which math program or spelling program or religion program, that's going to be important. So look for your resources. There are more and more forums, Facebook groups where parents are getting together and helping each other discover this. And I've joined a couple of them recently, and they're amazing. I'm seeing a lot of great stuff on there. So finding a support group from parents locally, parents at your church, parents on Facebook across the country, parents in your homeschooling group, that's going to be really helpful for you, because there are going to be other parents on there who have gotten through all the processes, the tried and true. And that's going to be important to know those. They're going to introduce you to resources as well. So kind of self-help within the resource section and reaching out to different communities that you can find to help support you. Also, there are a lot of Catholic homeschools that know how to do some of these modifications and help guide you towards, well, maybe you can try this spelling program versus this one, or modifying the curriculum. Again, that's another good resource that you can use that's going to be individualized to your student and your family, versus, again, if you're in the public school system or in a private school, there's only going to be so much flexibility within the academic coursework. Let's see. Okay, so if another idea is that if you're struggling with keeping up with the one-on-one teaching with your student, I would say either look for a tutor for your student, which is going to be a little bit more expensive, but it can pay off in the long run. Or look for a mother's helper if there's a high schooler close by who wants to help with maybe some of the younger kids or some of the other kids while you work with your student who has different learning needs. Then that's another idea to throw out there. And then a couple other things I'd say is that when you're working with someone who has special learning needs, you want to structure their day, and you also want to structure it with breaks in between and rewards in between. And usually when I'm talking with parents about rewards, it's not necessarily food, it's not necessarily like a Lego kit or something like that, although that can work. I usually recommend rewards like work for 10 minutes on this, take a 3-minute break, and play a game, or have your student run around outside. Structure it so that they can get up and do something different that's not academic, because they're going to find freedom and a freedom within that is kind of theirs to take. They know that if they sit down and they spend this long doing a problem, then they can go and take a quick break afterwards. And building those breaks in is going to help them get a mental break, get an emotional break, and be able to come back and do more work for you. The other thing that I'd say is it's okay to challenge your student. I don't know how your family works with this or how you operate in this department, but 50 years ago, we didn't have a whole lot of learning disabilities, or there wasn't a high percentage of students with learning disabilities. And part of that was because we didn't do very much testing back then. The other part was I think there were fewer cases of students with learning needs back then. But a lot of those students kind of muscled through. And they challenged themselves, the teachers challenged them. They didn't know they had a learning difficulty, and they did muscle through to some extent. Because again, I've talked to parents who say, oh, well, looking at all these symptoms, I had dyslexia back then, or I probably had ADHD, and I just had to sit down and do the work. And they survived. So I think it's okay to challenge your students to a certain extent. And again, you know your student, you know what they're capable of, when kind of the breaking point is, and how to gauge that. So challenge your students. It's okay to challenge them. Don't just give in and say, okay, well, you don't have to do this, this, and this. Challenge them, but also give them things at which they can succeed, because you want them to know that, yes, I can do this, even though it's hard. So challenge them, but also it's a fine balance. Challenge them, but give them things that they can succeed at. So again, just going through those things that I think is important to look at home is find good resources. Feel free to reach out for resources to your homeschool groups, to professionals, to forums and communities of other moms who have students that have similar difficulties. Make sure you have structured breaks within the day. Get your students active, get them playing outside, off their electronics. You don't want a whole lot of electronic time for your students. Minimize how much phone time they spend, how much computer time they spend, because that's a lot of those games and movies are already kind of designed to have a fast-paced focus where you don't sit and concentrate for a long time. And it's not the best approach for students with special education needs. Find a support group, find a mother's helper if you need it, or a tutor if you need it. Work with your homeschool, if you have a homeschool, to get good modifications for your student and good recommendations on programs. And then challenge them so that they can push themselves a little bit, but also succeed in certain things. So challenge them, but also give them things that they can do. And then kind of going back through everything, you want to look at both the modification structure of your homeschooling. You also want to look at the therapies that might support your student improving and growing in certain areas. So again, looking at the root of the problem. If you just look at the top and put a Band-Aid on it, yes, it's going to look okay for a little while, but as soon as you take that Band-Aid off, it's not actually going to be an improvement. And I'll see this with students that are in the school system. So for example, students with ADHD in the school system, they'll give them medication up until they graduate from school, and then they take that Band-Aid off, the medication. And then these individuals don't know what to expect afterwards. They've been on a certain kind of medication for so long to help with their ADHD, and then they don't know how to react after that. And that's not a very good approach. You can also think of it as like if you just do the modifications, again, it's good, but it's like putting training wheels on and not really taking them off. And if you try to take the training wheels off later on and they've been on for a long time, your student's going to struggle with that. So looking at the student as a whole person, yes, they need modification, but they also need to, again, look at the areas that are causing the learning difficulties and figure out if you can help those areas. Looking at them as a whole person and recognizing them as individuals who are destined for heaven as well. is super important, because you're going to be looking at how can I improve. You're also going to be looking at, okay, if there's only a certain level of improvement, what are the most important things I need to be teaching my student? And then again, just loving them and supporting them from home, very, very important. And it'll give them more motivation and more ambition to move forward if they know they're loved and supported at home, if they know that you believe in them and are there for them all the time. So I hope this has been a helpful discussion. Again, I think looking at the process of understanding, when we're talking about the process of understanding, it's going to be similar for every single person out there. And if it's easy for you, then that's great. But for some people, it's going to be a little bit harder. So knowing that and knowing the different parts of that is important in really supporting your students' learning needs. Identifying those areas is going to help you modify the curriculum the way that it would best be modified for their learning needs. And then also figuring out, okay, what other ways do I need to support my student? So I think that's pretty much it. I kind of raced through this, I'm realizing, because I finished a little bit early. So we have plenty of time for questions as soon as they start rolling in.
Hi, Margaret. There's a Q&A box there. I'm not sure if you're able to open it.
Sure.
Would you like to go through the questions, or would you like for me to read them out loud to you?
Sure, I can go through them. So first one is advice on finding the professionals for the testing. If you're looking at education testing to see if there's a diagnosis of a learning disability, then you're going to want to look for someone locally, because many of the tests can only be done in person. So that would be a question more for your community. You can look at, you can either do it privately or you can do it with the school system. If you do it with the school system, I would reach out to Homeschool Legal Defense just in case you get any pushback from the school pressuring you to put your student in public school if you don't want to. Just so that you know what resources you have before you go into the testing with the school. But you can do it privately with a clinical psychologist or an educational psychologist. You can also see if you have any universities in your area that have special education degrees they offer to students, either undergraduate or graduate students, because those students have to do testing, and they can sometimes do testing with your student for a more minimal price. And it's something where you can go to them, and a student will be testing your student, but it'll be overviewed by a professor. So that's another area that you can look at, is do you have a university close by, or clinical or educational psychologist, or the school system? That's what I recommend. But again, that's also something where if you have a local homeschool community, I would reach out to them and ask them what they've done, what other moms have done, and see maybe who's more homeschool friendly, who's less homeschool friendly, what experiences they've had. If you're looking for testing specifically for the auditory or the visual, you can go to an audiologist, or you can go to a behavior optometrist. So those are two things that are not necessarily education related, that you can go and get testing with them and see if there are any underlying difficulties. So I hope that's answered your question. I know it's a little bit vague, but the testing is something that's usually done locally, which means, and not everyone lives in the same area. I've worked with people all across the country, so I'm not familiar with every single community. So that would be something to ask, again, parents closer if you're looking for learning disability diagnosis. Second question is, do you know of any, okay, I answered that live, okay. Do you know of any special education curriculum for Down syndrome? Is there such a thing, or do I need to modify my child's regular curriculum? I would say I don't know of any specific curriculums for Down syndrome. Again, someone with Down syndrome has a lot of gifts and strengths, as well as some of the weaknesses that come with that. So that would be something I would reach out to either your current homeschool group that you're with. I don't know if you're with an umbrella school or if you're doing it on your own, and see if they have recommendations for how to modify the curriculum for your student. So I would say find a regular curriculum and then have help modifying it, either through a Catholic homeschool or again through a support group, see if there are any other moms who've out there who've done it before. And again, you can do this to some extent yourself. So if your student is better at visual learning, then have a lot of the learning done visually. Do quizzes on paper type thing. Or if your student struggles with memory, again, I would try to build up the memory, but if your student is struggling with that, then I would have the student read the material right before they take the test. So again, it's individual based on the student, and I would reach out to your local homeschool or a homeschooling umbrella school. And if you have questions about different curriculum, feel free to message me. I'll put my website up there and you guys can message me through the website. If you have specific questions about which homeschools, which curriculum might fit your needs better, then just let me know. Let's see. Okay. So one student has a significant, I have a daughter with Down syndrome and then a son with Asperger's. Question is, can you give me any advice as a mother who feels very overwhelmed at times, meeting their two different needs? I would say I'm not a mom myself, so I'm not experienced in that arena. I would say it's important. This is how I can speak to you from my experience. There are some days when I'm working with students and it's just a rough day for the student, which means it's a rough day for me. And you have to sit down and kind of minimize. Oftentimes we overthink what we're trying to do, and we overthink, okay, well, how much am I supporting this student? How much am I supporting that student? And it's okay to sit down and realize and recognize that you're doing the best you can, and what you're doing is not detrimental to your students' learning. Again, the most important things for you are loving your kids and teaching them the faith, which you're already doing. And those are the most important things. So if it's a really tough day and it's overwhelming, I think it's important to recognize, again, it's not a fault. It can be hard, and we're called to make sacrifices. Each of us is called to carry a certain cross, and offering that up to God is important, but also knowing that you're not doing anything wrong. You're probably doing many, many, many things right. And it's going to be a tough day. And that's where I would reach out again to a support group, call a friend, see who else out there is dealing with something similar to this. Again, I can only speak to you from my own personal experience working one-on-one with students, and there are rough days, there are good days, and you have to look forward to the good days. You have to just kind of keep your head down on the rough days and move forward, taking one step at a time. So I guess that's not probably the best advice, or I'm not necessarily able to speak directly to you about that because I'm not in that experience myself. But again, one step at a time, look forward to the good times, just keep your head down during the rough times. Know that you're not doing anything wrong, that you're doing many, many things right. And maybe take a little bit of time to work one-on-one with your son or one-on-one with your daughter. And again, maybe look for a mother's helper or a support group close by. There was someone who I knew who would reach out to her parish and see if anyone could come over and help her with her kids sometimes. So I hope that helps answer your question to some extent. All right, moving on to the next one. Let's see. Examples of modifications of curriculum. I would say I don't do a lot of modification myself because I don't work within the realm of just the curriculum. I often work within the realm of the therapy and helping the students improve their abilities, so they have to have fewer modifications. So modifications are often done by a homeschool umbrella school. I would say Trying to think if there's anything off the top of my head. It depends. It also depends. It highly depends on your student and their particular abilities. So some student, again, is going to be a visual learner. Another student's going to be an auditory learner. Some students going to struggle with processing speed. Another student's going to struggle with memory. So for example, if your student is struggling with processing speed, I would give them plenty of time to get through the day and say, okay, you can do these 5 problems and I'm okay with you taking 30 minutes. A student who's struggling with memory, it's going to be different. So again, something like it's okay for you to read the chapter right before you take the quiz type thing. And then maybe getting out drill cards or something like that. So it's highly dependent on your students' learning needs. And I would say a lot of homeschools are starting to add this to their programs where they're helping you do the modification. So what I would say with that, and what I would say with curriculums in general is, if you're not already part of a homeschool, Catholic homeschool, umbrella school, I would look into different umbrella schools, see what they have to offer, and then also ask them, okay, what modifications would you guys be able to help me with? And what is that going to look like in the everyday life that we have at home? So how are the modifications going to play out at home? Because some programs are going to be really good for some families. Other families are going to have to find something different. And that's where you have to go to the school or go to the professional and ask them those tough questions. 1, how is this going to help my student? 2, what is this going to look like at home? Those are important questions to ask anyone when you're looking for modifications or for therapies, because you want the right answer, which is, this is exactly how it's going to help your student, and this is what it's going to look like, versus, well, it's probably going to help your student in this, and this areas, but we're not quite sure. Things like that. So again, I would say it depends on your student. And again, a lot of homeschools are doing that. So I'd reach out to your homeschool and see what they can provide, or homeschool that you're looking at, see what they can provide. I'm sure you can find a lot of resources online as well for modifications to the curriculum. That's not something that I do very often because I'm looking more at the therapy side of things. All right.
Oh,
go ahead.
Margaret, I did want to, I know there's only one question in the Q&A box there, but we do have a few more. So if you have time afterwards, I could go ahead and ask those to you.
Yes, of course. So let me get through the last one and then feel free to just ask me the other questions.
Great.
Okay, what are strategies for coping with more than one child with special needs? I would say, I'm going to keep this up so I can look at it again. I would say, see if you can block out time to work with one student at a time, even if it's an hour with Susy and an hour for Johnny. I would see if you can block out time for that. And that's where I would recommend maybe seeing if there's a mother's helper close by or a friend from church who can help you 1 or 2 days a week, so you can devote more time to your students individually. Because I think it's really important, if you can, to work with your students individually. But also I would say, if you have more than one child with special needs, I would look for games, because there are a lot of games out there, brain games that they're coming out with, that actually support some of these processing difficulties that students are encountering. So for example, Blink is a game that I use a lot with the students, where it helps with visual processing speed in general. You can use it for pattern recognition exercises. You can use it as a speed game. So again, this is a game that you can use with more than one child at the same time. So if you have a couple students with similar learning needs, I would see if you can find a couple of games or a couple of activities that you can do together, where it's not specifically pointing at, okay, well, this is a game that we're going to play, but it's kind of for Susy, or it's kind of for Johnny. I hope that kind of answers your question. So I would say, 1, see if you can block out time individually with each one. And if you need help doing that, that's where you reach out to other families close by. 2, see if you can find games. or see if you can find an activity that will help support them, but where you can do it together as a group, even if they're a little bit different in age. So they don't necessarily have to be the same age, but there are a lot of brain games that are coming out. A website, I haven't explored it 100% myself, but Mindware has a lot of different categories for brain games or for different workbooks. And I would definitely look at that, because if you can put the games into any of the learning, that's actually where we see a lot of students improve, is if you can turn something into a game, because not only are they asked to learn the information, but they're also doing something fun. And the emphasis is taken off of the information and it's put into trying to win the game. So there's less anxiety when they're working with a game, and there's more improvement with regards to their learning. So for example, if you're learning the phonograms, get a whiteboard out, turn it into a tic-tac-toe board. They have to know the phonogram if they want to put an X on it. Or you can do that with multiplication too. I'm working with a couple of students who were working on multiplication and we're turning it into a tic-tac-toe board. Or bingo. I mean, bingo is a pretty basic game that many of you probably use, but find a game, excuse me, or two, so that you guys can do things together, but also find a little bit of time individually. All right.
Okay, great. I want to go back to the earlier question about the mom that had a child with both Down syndrome and Asperger's. I'm not sure what area that each person lives in, but I believe the person who posted is local in the area. And there is a mom who put together a group that they meet regularly. So if your area doesn't have it, I would encourage you, if you have a Yahoo group, to ask other moms. That way you can get together and offer the proper support that you need for your journey. Okay, our next question says, I know diet is important. What advice would you have for a busy mom to implement? If you could only make a few changes, what would you recommend?
Good question. So I know a lot of families eat well. What I would say, and this is based on a diet that you can look up, it's called the GAPS diet by Dr. Natasha Campbell McBride. It's a healing diet protocol, but she recommends a lot of fermented foods, so sauerkraut, kefir, things with a lot of probiotics in them, because you have to support the digestive tract with healthy microbes, and then also broth, homemade broth, not necessarily the broth with the bouillon in it, but you want to look at a diet that is not necessarily just healthy fruits and vegetables, but you also want to look at a diet that's going to be healing. I would say no sugar at all. Minimize the carbohydrates that you're having, because those quickly turn into sugar, and for students with learning difficulties, any kind of sugar is bad. And then I would say also, for some families, you'll have to minimize the dairy as well. It depends on what your family can do, but I would say have a lot of soups, and really look at, I would recommend getting the book and reading it actually, and then you can figure out, okay, well, if I can only do a couple things, what are the most important things that she recommends in the book? And in my mind, based on what I remember and what I've seen and heard, I would say cutting out the sugars and a lot of the carbohydrates, the starches, and then also increasing the probiotic intake through live sauerkraut and kefir, sometimes kombucha, although that has a lot of sugar in it, and broth. So that's what I would say. And again, with broth, you can make a batch of soup and the whole family can eat it. So you don't necessarily have to make special food for one student, you can do it for the whole family. That's what my family has done. So we've just made it for the whole family. If someone needs to do a diet change, we do it for the whole family.
Excellent advice. Okay. All right. Our next question is, what advice do you have for a mom trying to discern whether their child is just a late reader or whether there is a problem that should be addressed?
Good question. I would say if your student is under 9 years old, I would, some students read late. So I would see if your student is having trouble with remembering the phonograms, because that can sometimes be a an indication that there's actually a difficulty with the reading. Was your student, when they were younger, were they able to speak clearly and well? Or did they have speech difficulties, or could they not hear the sounds very well? So if you asked them to say a sound a certain way, were they able to mimic that? So those would be indications if they had a speech difficulty when they were younger, if they aren't able to memorize the phonograms very well, if they're having trouble with tracking with their eyes. So if you see them kind of jumping around on the page, I would say that might be an indication of a reading difficulty. Also, if they have poor memory skills, so if they're reading through a page and they sound out a word at the top of the page, and then they go like 2 lines down and there's the word again, and they have to sound it out all over again. If they're a little bit past the beginner learning phase and they're starting to read like small little chapter books, that would also be an indication that there might be a learning or a reading difficulty, is if they don't have the memory, the visual memory needed for the reading. But if you are seeing very few of these signs and your student, again, is under 9 years old, so that, like, for example, if your student is 6.5 or 7, I would do the wait and see approach. And that's not always the best approach for everyone, but it is okay with a reader to do that sometimes to see if it clicks at a certain point. My brother didn't read till he was closer to 9. I didn't read till I was 8.5. And so it's okay to have a little bit of a late reader. If your student is older than 9, I would say you want to look at that area, because if your student is struggling with reading at that age, that you shouldn't really be seeing that. So if your student isn't able to read grade 1 books, grade 2 books at age 9, then I would check out that area.
Okay, great. I have one more question over here. I'm not sure if you touched on it already. Do you have any curricula you like to recommend for language, arts, or math?
For math, I've heard Matthew C is really good, and I've looked into it a little bit. I haven't used their materials myself, but when you're working with a student who has special learning needs, you want to find programs that emphasize multi-sensory learning. Because again, when your student is struggling with the senses, or they're struggling with the processing once they get that information, you want to kind of bombard their learning pathways from 2 or 3 different angles. So multi-sensory programs are really good. Matthew C is what I've heard a lot of families use with success. I would say if you can do Montessori math, if your student's really young, that's good, because there are a lot of hands-on manipulatives in Montessori. If your student's older with math and Matthew C isn't working, you could look at teaching textbooks. I don't know necessarily that that's multisensory, but it's something where it has a lot of, it has a DVD, I think, that goes with it, and there's more immediate feedback with that. So those are the math programs I'd recommend. Again, that's not exhaustive whatsoever, but that's what I've seen other people using. That's what I've heard moms recommending to other moms. And again, if you reached out to a Catholic homeschool, they might have more resources than that. With literacy, that is a tricky one. I would say finding that one's something where with literacy is a little bit more challenging, because you really have to help the student build from the ground up versus just diving into a literacy program. I would say that Mother of Divine Grace or a classical curriculum like that, just a curriculum in general, would help your student build from the ground up. So starting off with very visual stories, Aesop's Fables, building up into the Book of Virtues, saint stories, a lot of those things, starting off with small stories and then moving to larger and larger ones. That's what I recommend for a literacy approach, is a classical approach where you start off with just the students observing things and describing what they observe, and then move to very small stories that are very, very visual, and then moving to longer and longer stories, and then eventually literature later on. So that's what There is a specific program that comes to mind for that that's built with those components starting at the beginning. But if you look at maybe a classical curriculum reading list and looking at what grade 1 looks like, grade 2, grade 3, I would look at that progression that they have within there and see if you can mimic that at home, because that's a classical approach is going to be a natural approach, and it's naturally going to help your student build up the literacy skills that they need. Good question.
Okay. Thank you, Margaret. That was very informative and helpful, and I really like how you incorporated the whole person. And I'd like to let you all know that if you're interested in learning more about what Margaret has to offer, please use the link on the virtual vendor hall webpage to view Margaret's Secret Garden Pathways educational website if you'd like more information.